Hey guys, welcome to The Journey, where we simply want to help all students walk with God. And we've been going through a series called Upsidedown Kingdom. This series has been going through the Sermon on the Mount, which is Matthew 5 through 7, where Jesus teaches all of his disciples and more people how to be a true disciple. And so we are going to go, as we're finishing this series, and just do a quick review. We've kind of called each and every lesson we've done to be blank. And that's because every lesson that Jesus teaches is how we might stop living in our own kingdoms and start living as citizens of the kingdom of heaven. But as we go for a quick review, we start with Matthew 5. And the first 10 verses are what we like to call the Beatitudes. These are simple characteristics of what true disciples would be like. And they are poor in spirit, they are those who mourn, they are those who are meek, they are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, they are those who are merciful, they are those who are pure in heart, they are those who are peacemakers, and they are those who are persecuted. And each one of these comes with a specific blessing that's attached to it. But what God wants us to hear from these is that we're called to be humble and to rely on God. And as we see that, we need to start living in a holy manner that is no longer of the upside down kingdom that we've been living in. And then as we face trials, that we will be persecuted, but we will also persevere. And as we persevere, we'll be rewarded in heaven. Right after that, we have the salt and light that Jesus is telling us that we as disciples are called to be influential people in our communities. Just as the way that light penetrates into the darkness, we are there to help guide and love and work with all the people around us. One of my favorite students named Graham, he calls it, as Christians are called into the world, we are simply here to help spice it up. Afterwards, we finish that in Matthew 17. And so we started with week 1. We told each other that Matthew loves sandwiches and that he must have written this while he was super hungry, because he always pairs things and then fills in these sandwiches. And this sandwich right here, you have the top and the bottom loaves are in 5:17 and 7:12. And it simply starts with the law and the prophets. And then between those, Jesus would take those laws and all the prophetic writings, and he would try and change and turn the way that we look at these, in order that when we look at how we should not murder or how we should not commit adultery, it's looking at the heart, the way that he was talking about how we need to be pure in heart. And then he calls us to other things about how we should be praying and how we might be generous to everyone else. And he fills that big sandwich in with that. But he finishes in 7:12 with the simple golden rule. If you want to learn how to obey the prophets, if you want to learn how to obey the laws, all you need to do is do unto others as you would have them do to you. And afterwards, that brings us to our final section that we're covering tonight, which is an evaluation. And so tonight we're calling this lesson To Be Wise, because Jesus again put us at a crossroads, and he's hoping that instead of choosing to be foolish and go down this narrow path, that we would choose to be wise and build our house on this strong foundation of his words. And so we're going to pick it up in 13, where it says, "You are the salt of the earth." Sorry, that's Matthew 5:13. 7:13 reads, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." This is the start of a 4-section evaluation of how we might be able to determine who is disciple. And that includes us. So before we start judging each other and judging the rest of the world, it's important to do this self-evaluation. Because just as Jesus said in 7:5, we must remove the log out of our own eye before we try and pick out the dust out of our brother's eyes. And with that said, let's jump back into this 7:13. So Jesus here is giving us ultimately 2 choices. We can take the road that's taken very often, or we can take a road that's less traveled. We know what Jesus has commanded us by reading through the rest of these earlier passages and these earlier lessons. We know what he demands of the citizens of the kingdom of heaven. But are you going to choose to follow him? Each and every day we must pick up our cross, and that means that we must sacrifice our lives in order to glorify God and live the way according to him. And the world counteroffers, and what might seem like freedom really isn't. Because the world says, why don't you go ahead and serve yourself with every single indulgence that we have here to provide? But Jesus is reminding us here that that's not true freedom. That's the road that leads us to sin, the slavery that comes along with it, and eventually death. We will either follow Christ wholeheartedly, or we will go down the path of destruction. There can be no half-hearted commitment to Jesus. If you are not on the narrow road to discipleship, then you are on the wide road to eternal damnation. And that brings us to our second one. Well, how can we determine who's good and who's bad? Well, 15 says, watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. But their fruit you will recognize them. People pick grapes from thorn bushes, or figs from thistles. Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. And ultimately, this is teaching us about how to recognize false teachers. But if this is also what we're trying to use as a self-evaluation of tonight, we have to look at ourselves and say, are you pretending? We have been currently in this pandemic, right? And as we go out into the world in this time, we're called to wear masks. However, I heard this one story who said when the quarantine began, that was not when she began wearing a mask. She began wearing masks long ago when she was pretending to be a Christian when she was not. And so she determined during this time that she wasn't going to keep being and pretending to be a sheep. So I have to ask you the question, are you pretending to be a sheep, or are you wearing a mask? And the next section makes it clear what happens to those who are pretending. So as we pick it back up in 21, it says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? And in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. This teaching should instill in us a healthy fear, though. Not something that is just causing us to worry whether we're a Christian or not. Because as we continue to read through this, it is possible to do great works in our Savior's name and not assent to his lordship without really trusting him for our salvation. The people in today's passage have a false assurance of the Christian faith. They know the right things, but they do not do the right things. Their faith is dead, for their works are not done in obedience to Christ. Like many who took the broad path, we can be fools if we trust in our own profession without repenting of our sin and doing what Jesus says. In our last section, even though it is still a warning, it gives us hope. It says this in 7:24, therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundations on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, and the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great clash. Today is Monday, and we just had this crazy storm with huge high winds, right? And I'm happy that I'm in this amazing building in which it has still standing. But that's because the people knew how to build this building. My question to you is, do you know how to build your faith? God is telling us that we don't have to worry. We can have assurance of our faith if we trust in His words. And it brings us all the way back to Matthew 5 with the Beatitudes. And if we look at poor in spirit, this is where we learn that we are driven towards the cross, because we know that we have a lack. We know that we need something that is outside of ourselves. And it's at the cross where Jesus can pick us back up. And when we are sorrowful over our sin, it is then when we are actually more ready to obey Christ than before. This is what it means to build our lives on Christ and have a strong foundation. God knows that we will never be perfect in this life, but He does actually expect us to grow in our faith and increasingly conform to Christ by loving our fellow Christians and understanding doctrine and following His commands. Those whose lives increasingly reflect such things can be sure that they do not profess Christ falsely. Let today's message prompt you to take actual spiritual inventory. Where have you seen growth? Where do you see a need to be more obedient? And when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at His teaching, because He taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. Christ taught these things with authority, not only because He was God, but because He did these things out well. He lived out the Sermon on the Mount. And so our call is to simply reflect on this sermon day in and day out, and throughout the rest of His teachings, and build this as our foundation. This is where I have to say goodnight, but I am excited to continue walking in this journey with God, even though we're closing this chapter on the Upside-Down Kingdom. But let's not keep building our kingdoms of this upside-down world, but start living as citizens of the kingdom of heaven. Peace out, guys.